This is the Mark class. What chapter are we in?
Turn in your Bibles to Matthew 5. We're still in Matthew 5. The objective is to get all the way through chapter 7. And I know that there may be some people with some wagers on whether that's going to happen or not at this point. We're going to do our best to do that. I have plotted a course. So we left off last week just kind of laying some more groundwork, as I've been doing quite a bit about these Hebrew words that occur, or those ideas occur in chapter 5 and verse 48, the summary verse of this section that we're in now. And I've attributed quite a bit of importance to this verse that says you are to be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. I said last week we should try not to be intimidated by that, but to understand the idea of perfect there as in wholeness or being wholehearted in our devotion to God. And that should be the goal of each one of us. So Jesus does not present a goal that is impossible for us to attain. He is, however, asking us, very much like he was doing earlier in the chapter, to raise the bar of righteousness, because that's really what we're talking about now. Your righteousness must surpass that of the Pharisees in particular. And so that goes hand in hand with that concept. And so we are talking about these revolutionary kingdom declarations that Jesus is making, beginning with those 9 Beatitudes and the 3 metaphors, and we into the sermon body, and the idea of Jesus is discussing and giving explanation to the Torah, which would be very familiar in the minds of these people, but he's speaking about it in such a way and with such depth that these teachings are quite revolutionary in their mind. The first of these 6 case studies we've already gone through, and these we've made the big point of saying that these are descriptive of how human beings are to interact with one another with human dignity, understanding that each one has the image of God that they are bearing, and we need to treat each other accordingly. These next 3 that we're in now, these last 3, before we get to that summary verse, be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect, is involving oaths and retaliation and loving your enemies. And so as we think about a summary of this triad, these 3, I would just begin by saying that here we're talking about, in addition to granting to other human beings dignity, we're having to understand how to navigate very difficult relationships. Sometimes when relationships find themselves at conflict with one another, when wills between human beings are clashing, when there is an inequity in power between human beings. And so that is what we're talking about in these next 3. There's this idea of human beings trying to coerce other human beings to do things in these. And so as we begin today talking about these things, I want us to keep in mind that what he is really driving home is this idea of the power of our words and the power of our actions toward our fellow human beings. Now, I wanted to begin by reminding us of the scene of Jesus speaking to these people and the environment in which these words are spoken. So this is during the time in which Rome is an occupying force in Palestine. And I want you to think about that in terms of what we're discussing today in this second triad of case studies. Does the Roman occupation hold any meaning in terms of helping us have some context to what Jesus is talking about in these next three. And how does it do that? What is the meaningfulness of that? But before I'm going to ask you to answer that question, I just want you to ruminate about that. How does the Roman occupation impact these words of Jesus? Let's just begin reading in verse 33. Again, you have heard that the ancients were told, you shall not make false vows, but shall fulfill your vows to the Lord. But I say to you, make no oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by earth, for it is the footstool of his feet, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. Nor shall you make an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. But let your statement be yes, yes, or no, no. And anything beyond these is of evil. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist him who is evil, but whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, let him have your coat also. And whoever shall force you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Give to him who asks of you, and do not turn away from him who wants to borrow from you. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, in order that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. For if you love those who love you, what reward have you? Do not even the tax gatherers do the same? And if you greet your brothers only, what do you more than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? Therefore, you are to be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. Now, in that context, in thinking about what I asked you to think about, the Roman occupation, tell me something significant about that. Yes, Steve.
Well, certainly the 1 mile that they're mentioning, the Romans were able to compel a Jew to carry their load for 1 mile. And what's recorded is they would go 1 mile and not a step further.
Yeah. So that was the law. The soldiers were able to grab a citizen of this region and say, I've been carrying this pack for a while, and now since I'm giving such wonderful service to this community, you are required now to carry this a mile. And they couldn't ask for anything more than that. But that was something that they could require. But that, what an onerous task that must have been for these Jews who were living in this land of occupation and viewed them as the enemy, not the benefactor. What other thoughts do you have about the Roman occupation and its meaningfulness here?
Pretty strongly against what David prayed and taught and said in the Psalms regarding adversaries and how they would have been viewing the Romans.
Yeah.
Especially Psalms 109. I think he even curses their children.
Yeah. Crush the enemies under your feet. Let me have domination over those who would oppress me. Yeah. Those were...
And that would have been their mindset.
Of course. Yeah, it very much was. And that was the expectation of their Messiah in the way that they were thinking about that in so many ways. Yeah, Chris.
Whether it was, just the common man on the street, or whether it was a scribe, a Pharisee, a Levite, the most religious of them all, it would have been just universally accepted that you hate the Romans. You're going to mutter about them. You're going to openly talk, when they're around. You're going to openly talk about them, in your everyday life, and that's just what you do. You despise, loathe, in every single way. And Jesus said, "Nope, we don't do that. Not in God's kingdom." And that, talking about revolutionary, that would have blown them away. Well, what,
Absolutely.
you're going in with them? I mean, how can you, now they're looking at it, politically or socially. It's like, how dare you, even think of that? But Jesus says, no, we're not talking about anything earthly here. We're talking about going, looking at it from God's perspective. So that would have been something that would have given them pause at the very least.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So, along with what Chris is saying, there's just this level of rage in you that there's just the baseline is higher now. And you're just vexed every day. You see a Roman centurion and you're just unhappy about it. And and then you start scrutinizing your neighbors. How much are they collaborating with these occupiers? And just the baseline of anger and resentment just goes up.
Almost don't even want to bring up this next point. Is there any crossover between the atmosphere of hate in their day and in the atmosphere of divisiveness and unrest of our day in terms of politics? So, yeah, there's quite a bit of crossover there. I think we could make application. Yes.
I feel like in different stages of my life, I read things differently. Now, as a parent, if anybody's threatening my child, or like,
Mama bear.
is it right? Like
Mama
that
bear's
just comes
coming
out.
out.
And the thought of a nation being be able to control my children or make them do things, or it just, I'm not gonna like that, like I'm not gonna love it for sure.
Right. So remember, way back in the Beatitudes. Oh, another
It's
comment?
okay. It's okay.
I'm sure it was good, Bonnie.
What if it's not?
We'll make that judgment.
What if we were able to look at the world we live in now as occupied by sin and by Satan and see who we're to be to the people around us?
I knew it was good. I knew it was good. Absolutely. Uh-oh, we're on the roll now.
Well, so we're talking about the kingdom of heaven,
Yeah.
and that is almost like it's a different layer of citizenship. No matter where we are, whether it's the U.S. or somewhere in Europe, we have a different allegiance, and that's always been trouble.
Yeah. So the point is, this is super relatable to us. And what Jesus is calling us to is something noble and higher than what we're experiencing in this life. And so, way back in the Beatitudes when he said, blessed are the peacemakers. That is, he's fleshing out what that means now in this section. Blessed are the peacemakers. And when you're living in a world of contemptuousness toward one another, and conflict, and oppression, and inequality of power, and all of these things, to become a peacemaker in that setting is quite a challenging endeavor. But Jesus is calling us to that. And so it is quite meaningful that here, as he talks about how human beings try to coerce and manipulate one another in so many ways. And they will even begin to harm and hurt one another and insult one another and hate one another. He calls us to peace. And in this first one, he begins by talking about the power of words. The power of words. How was this world created? By the Word of God. The power of words. And so, when he begins, you have heard that the ancients were told, you shall not make false vows, but fulfill your vows to the Lord. He's not really quoting anything directly from the Torah. It's kind of a conglomeration of a few different ideas that we have. We can just look at a few verses here. again in Leviticus, the 19th chapter and verse 12. The Torah says, "You shall not swear falsely by my name, so as to profane the name of your God. I am the Lord," or "I am Yahweh." To me, this is an explanation of Exodus 20 and verse 7, to not take the Lord's name in vain. He's giving further explanation. So if that is what Jesus is quoting, that would be directly from one of the 10 commandments, don't take the Lord's name in vain. Generally, we think about that as profanity, or using the Lord's name in a way to say something in a profane way. And that's absolutely true. But is it possible to profane the name of the Lord in other ways? And absolutely it is possible. And so that is a significant leap from the way we typically think of using the Lord's name in vain. So Jesus says, make no vows or oaths. So, and there's a couple other Old Testament references. I don't want to spend our time in the Old Testament, but you can just mark those down and look at those later. Numbers 30, verse 2, Deuteronomy 23, 21 to 23. Those are very similarly saying, you make a vow, you keep it. It's not that complicated. You swear an oath by the name of God, especially, honor it. So there were a couple different words in Hebrew that are useful here. And I'm not going to go into the Hebrew word, but there's a word for Hebrew which is typically translated as vow, and that is a word that describes a promise that a human being makes to God. That's a vow. So you keep that vow. You promise something to God, you keep it. And then there's another word that's commonly translated as oath, sometimes covenant, and that is something that is between human beings. So I make a promise to Chris, or I guarantee, or I enter into a covenant. That is the word oath, as it appears in our Bibles most of the time. And so when we swear by the name of Yahweh, that is a significant step to take. And the Torah says, if you do that, you be sure to fulfill it. Now, does that mean that if I don't swear by the name of Yahweh, that I don't have to keep my word? You don't find that. You don't find that in the Old Testament anywhere. Yet that was a prevailing thought, especially among whom? The Pharisees, who were always concerned about the legalities, the limits of what I'm required to do. What does the law require? Okay, if I make a vow to God, I've got to keep that. But we'll turn to Matthew 23 in just a moment. Now, another contextual issue that we need to think about. Jesus is living in a time where there has been this tradition for 100, 200 years where the name of Yahweh is not even verbalized. For fear of profaning it or taking it in vain in some way, the tradition has become, we'll just not even say the name. That way we'll guarantee that we will not profane that name. And so in Jesus' day, it would be unthinkable for somebody to say, I swear by the name of Yahweh that I will do such a thing. And so instead of that, what they would do is, I will make an oath or I will make a vow, I will swear by the temple, or I will swear by the altar, or I will make an oath and guarantee it by saying I swear by heavens itself. So things that are closely associated with God, I will swear by those things. Now, this was and it's kind of hard for us to relate to this, I think, in some way. Because this was a common way of expression for people of this day, but not so much for us today. We make guarantees of our word in some ways, but this was an everyday kind of occurrence in Jesus' day. And so they would look at things, again, that were closely associated with God. Let's go ahead and go over to Matthew 23. And they would swear by those things, but then they started making up some rules about that. The Pharisees did. And so as we find, it's quite common from the Sermon on the Mount to the bookend of Matthew 23 comes out where Jesus is really dealing with some of the hypocrisy of the Pharisees. So beginning in verse 16 of Matthew 23, woe to you, blind guides, who say, whoever swears by the temple, that is nothing. But whoever swears by the gold of the temple, he's obligated. Absurd, right? Yeah. You fools and blind men, which is more important, the gold or the temple that sanctified the gold? And whoever swears by the altar, that is nothing. But whoever swears by the offering upon it, he is obligated. You blind men, which is more important, the offering or the altar that sanctifies the offering? Therefore, he who swears both by the altar and by everything on it. And he who swears by the temple swears both by the temple and by him who dwells within it. And he who swears by heaven swears both by the throne of God and by him who sits upon it. Yes, Steve.
Something that kind of fits in with this too is Matthew 15, where you have people who said, I can't take care of my parents because I've devoted my assets to the work of the Lord.
Yeah. And so what's happening here? Let's find some loopholes.
Yes.
We're going to find loopholes in the law. And so, can you imagine? I want to persuade you in some way to do something or enter into an agreement with me or to give me what I want. And so I swear by the temple that if you will do this for me, I will do this in return, whatever that is. All right, let's just kind of put out a scenario here. It's harvest season. I need to harvest my wheat. My neighbor has a cart that would really help me a lot in the harvesting of my wheat. So I go to my neighbor and I say, neighbor, I'm harvesting my wheat. May I borrow your cart? And my neighbor says to me, well, Bruce, I loaned you my cart last year in harvest season. And you brought it back to me broken. And so I say, oh, okay. So I haven't provided much reliability to my neighbor. So here's the remedy. Neighbor, I swear by the temple, I will bring your cart back to you in fine condition this time. And so my neighbor's swear by the temple. Well, that's a sacred thing. But when I bring it back to him, it's broken again. I swore by the temple. Not the gold of the temple. Come on. What do you expect? And it becomes an absurd thing. So what I have done is, I don't have credibility on my own. So I need to borrow God's credibility. I'm going to say, because God is so faithful and I'm invoking God in some way, I am borrowing from His holiness, from His reputation, so that I can manipulate somebody into doing what I want them to do. Right? That's what we're talking about here, manipulation. You don't have credibility on your own, you want to borrow somebody else's credibility. And Jesus exposes that. We need to be credible without any of these surrounding things. Jesus makes it so simple, right? It's just so simple. Just tell the truth. Always. There aren't any loopholes. We shouldn't be looking for ways that we can get our way and then kind of get one over on the neighbor. Jeff, I think you had your hand up and then Chris.
Well, you kind of said it right there. That was heading toward your thought. We say, I swear on my mother's grave, or I swear on my, child's grave. There's some common things. I swear on the Bible. Same thing. It's just, you basically said it. It's a lack of credibility. You haven't proven yourself in the past, and so, not only manipulation but gaslighting. These kind of things to be able to get what you want. It's really about, have you built a relationship with that person? And if you haven't, then that's where you really need to start, so you can just build that trust on your own merit.
Yeah, the trust needs to be established, and that's not something that you can borrow from God. You need to put in that effort. Right. Yes, Chris.
My wife likes to watch all these court shows, and I don't know how many times I've heard someone will say, in the court or to their own lawyer, say, listen, I swear to God, I did not do it. I had nothing to do with that. And that is such a flippant, they have no real belief in God, dependence on God, awe of God. And just to throw that out, I swear to God, I've heard that so many times, and I cringe when I hear that, because at the very least, that's using the Lord's name in vain. I mean, it's amazing how we do the very things God says don't use my name in vain. And how many times do people say, oh my God? It could be in frustration, it can be in surprise, it can be in anger, it can be in, in joy, but it's, oh my God.
Yeah,
OMG.
it almost makes me trust you less when you say that now, because it has been you. If you're going to go there, it's like,
Why do you need to swear on your grandmother's grave? Well, there's something weak about your argument, right? You're not trustworthy otherwise. Now you're saying that this is something sacred to me. I would never, Mr. Unreliable, now I'm supposed to trust that you would never invoke your grandmother's grave. It's just a pitfall that human beings fall into, when Jesus' point is simple transparency. Verbal integrity. Be true to who you are. And don't try to manipulate people into getting your way. That's, again, one of the things around this. And I want to kind of just plunge just a little bit deeper into that concept. And I don't know if this is exactly related, but it occurs to me that people do that in realms of faith as well. And I've got to be very careful. I need to be very careful. If somebody comes to me and says, I feel really convicted by the Spirit about this, they're trying to impress me with how important this is to them. And there's a sense in which they're trying to persuade me to join them in this endeavor, whatever that is. Some may even directly say, God told me this, that this is what we need to pursue. Now, I believe God in the Spirit intervenes in the lives of human beings. I believe that. So I want to be very careful in the way that I say this. But I know that people have abused that, just as we've been talking about. There have been preachers that I will accuse of this. God told me this message for you to receive. And God told me that if I don't raise this much money, then he's going to kill me. A very famous evangelist named Oral Roberts had that vision, shared that vision with the world. I need to raise this much money for this endeavor or I will die. God told me this.
To die is gain, though, right?
The way to go.
I don't mind laughing at that because I don't believe it. I don't. If he heard some message or he had some dream, okay, but it is not consistent within the character of God to do that. I view that as a manipulation of people. Invoking God to manipulate people to get what you want is what Jesus is condemning in this. And so religious leaders can be the ones most guilty of this. And so it's imperative that we be completely transparent and that we be given completely to verbal integrity. And let your yes be yes and your no be no. And how did Jesus conclude this statement? He said,
Anything else is.
anything beyond this is of evil, is of Satan. I think Jesus is painting a picture here of the Garden of Eden and of the serpent. Because that's exactly what the serpent did. Did God say you couldn't eat of any of these trees? No, that's not what God said. But it planted a seed of doubt in Eve, and she said, oh no, we can eat from any of these trees, but not this one tree. And the serpent then goes on to tell him just a lie. You will not die. You will not die. When people manipulate the words of God to get people to be deceived or to be manipulated to accomplish their selfish purpose, it's of Satan. That's a radical statement that Jesus is making, and one that should cause us to shudder when we consider being anything other than honest with the words that we speak. So, the bottom line of this is what? Cultivate a reputation of honesty and credibility, and you won't have to be swearing by the temple or its gold or the altar or the sacrifice itself. It is of evil, is the serpent in Genesis 3. And anytime we take those words and do anything other than speak in truth, then we are losing our own credibility. So do not manipulate. Honor the people in your life with truthfulness and honesty and integrity. That's how we honor one another. Deal with one another in transparent faith. That is the point of this. You may have other comments you'd like to make in the 1 minute that we have. Yes.
1 minute. Okay.
Take as much time as you want.
I'll make it quick. Back in Matthew 23, I think it's interesting how the Pharisees are teaching the people that, swearing by the sanctuary is nothing but by the gold. How they've forgotten and are teaching that the sanctuary that's been made holy by God's presence is not important. And rather the gold, maybe they're valuing just the element and the actual value of the material gold itself. And same for the altar, that, this design of the altar that's been passed down since Moses, they're discrediting that and instead putting more credit on this offering that I actually put on there and something I can see and touch. And I just think they've lost their honor of God in all this. And if I don't honor God appropriately, I'm certainly not going to honor people made in the image of God. And that's going to come out I'm going to be comfortable using my words to take an advantage over the people around me, whether I swear by this or formulate my argument however way. If I'm not honoring God, I'm certainly not going to honor my brothers and sisters here or anywhere else.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for your good attention.